Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. Today we're going to continue our book club series by taking a look at this month's offering, which is Logistics in the Falklands War, a case study in expeditionary warfare. Now I know everyone will struggle to contain their excitement when discussing one of the most captivating subjects in the world, logistics and paperwork. But like always, we'll push through and see what concepts we can glean from this rather unknown military conflict, and see what aspects we can apply to our more modern life. But first up, what is the Falklands War? This conflict, largely unknown in American society, was a very short war fought between the United Kingdom and Argentina in the year 1982. The reason that this conflict goes largely ignored by American audiences is because, Americans weren't involved in this conflict really, beyond, support and things like that. This was more of a direct hot war between the UK and Argentina, but also because the war was very short. It was only 74 days long. However, in those 74 days, absolutely astounding and groundbreaking military doctrine was being forged and shaped. Doctrine which affects American policy to this day. Despite many people not really knowing this, a lot of the doctrine that we get from the joint environment, a lot of the big push to have a more joint-centric kind of operating style, allowing different service branches to work together in the same space. This really goes back to the idea of combined arms warfare in World War II, but it's really been shaped a lot by some of the things that the British noted during this conflict, especially when it comes to logistics. What is known to the Western world as the Falklands War began on April 2nd, 1982, when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, the South Sandwich Islands, and the islands of South Georgia. This war was largely the result of very poor relations between the UK and Argentina and the long-standing territory disputes of the islands themselves. Now, before we go any further, I want to show a map of the world because this is really kind of the crux of the whole argument of why the Falklands War is so important to study. This is where the Falkland Islands are located, a few hundred miles off the coast of Argentina, and roughly 8,000 nautical miles away from the British Isles. We can maybe start to see what the main problem is with this war. Almost all of the issues that stemmed from the Falklands War, and really the largest problems that the United Kingdom faced during this conflict, stemmed from the fact that they're 8,000 miles from home, having to conduct an amphibious operation, an expeditionary operation, where there is no land in sight, and the closest island that they had to really rely on as far as colonial support was Ascension Island, which is still about 3,000 miles away from the end target. So, here you have the Royal Navy with their military might having to wage an extremely expeditionary war. This is one of the most far-flung regions of the Earth, and the British military is having to go up against a near-peer adversary. Just as a point of disclaimer before going forward, this book was written from the British perspective. It includes basically nothing from the Argentine perspective, and it was also written, interestingly enough, by an American. So this was written by Kenneth Prevratsky, who is a major general in the U.S. Army, and has written a few books on different kinds of concerns for military logistics. So if you're wanting to do a bit of research on your own and learn about kind of the other side of the coin and what the Argentines' perspective during this conflict was, this is not the book for you. This is purely the British experience. In fact, the Argentines don't even call these islands the Falklands. That's the British name for this archipelago. They call these islands the Malvinas. So that's definitely something to note if you're trying to get, the Argentine perspective. So rather than go chapter by chapter, page by page, I'm just going to list the top lessons learned from this war that we can use to apply to our situation today. Most of these ideas are very high-level thoughts here because I don't know about anybody else, but I don't really plan on being a fleet admiral anytime soon and, coordinating mass chains of logistics on ships and things like that. However, we might be able to glean some lessons learned here and there. One of the main lessons that kind of jumps out right to start with is the importance of planning and to not really do anything at all without a plan. Now, this kind of ties into a larger idea, and that larger idea, which kind of encompasses the rest of the book, is that I think, and this is just my opinion, but I think that considering the nature of the conflict, the expediency by which a response was necessary, the distance covered, and the time period, the United Kingdom really did an outstanding job when it comes to logistics, preparedness, even combat and things like that. But it still was not good enough to result in very little casualties. This was a very hot, very shootin' war that occurred down in the South Atlantic, and it ended up killing hundreds of British military personnel in a very short time period. This war, largely forgotten by most outside the UK, was most definitely a near-peer conflict, and even though the British military and the British Royal Navy did everything right, in my opinion, mostly, for the most part, they did everything, as best they could, it still wasn't good enough, and there were still some serious snafus that ended up causing some very serious problems. That's kind of the main lesson for the book, is that, look, no plan survives first contact, right? We all know this, but when it comes to logistics, you really have to over-prepare, to an extreme degree when it comes to logistics. And you have to be okay with accepting that even if you do everything right, even if you go above and beyond the call of duty, that still may not be enough. And a lot of times, some of the more, everyday kind of concerns get left out. Like, one of the main concerns for the British moving forward is, look, this is 8,000 miles away. When Henry Leach, the Navy Chief of Staff, first kind of brought the military plan to Margaret Thatcher and kind of outlaid what they were going to be doing, and what this military force might look like to go back down there and take these islands back from the Argentines. He told Margaret Thatcher that the preparations would take 3 weeks to put together, mostly because they had to commandeer civilian freighters and convert them to military use to just haul the massive logistics train with them. And when he told her it would take 3 weeks, she said, you misspoke. You mean 3 days, right? And he said, no ma'am, it's going to be 3 weeks. We're going 8,000 miles, and that's no picnic, right? The sheer distance itself, if you just look at a map and realize that there's really no land that was friendly in the area, having to run an entire expeditionary force and a logistics force at the same time is really, really challenging. But Margaret Thatcher's initial reaction to this is really the second lesson, which is that governments are always too slow to act to military threats. This is a story as old as time, but the lead up to the Argentine invasion of the Falklands was absolutely predictable in every conceivable way. Local media in Argentina was talking about it. Tensions were very high. You can just look at the statements of pundits and locals in the area, local newspapers. But the British Empire, because Argentina was a far-flung quasi-adversary at the time, they didn't really care. And by the time the invasion happened, they just got caught with their trousers down. Even though every indicator was given prior to this military action that Argentina was absolutely going to invade the Falkland Islands. So that's something to keep in mind, is that politicians and a lot of times even military leadership is really, really slow to react to very large, very obvious strategic threats, which kind of sounds familiar in today's context. A third lesson learned is a classic story again, in that maps are always a problem. When Argentina invaded the Falklands, basically nobody in the military knew where it was. A lot of dudes literally, as they were getting on the boat to form up this expeditionary force and head to the South Atlantic, they were all wondering, wait a minute, how did Argentina get all the way up to Scotland? They thought that the Argentines had invaded Scotland because Falkland is kind of like a Scottish sounding name, I guess. So they had to explain, no, this is a very unknown, sparsely inhabited rock in the South Atlantic, and we're going to be going 8,000 miles to go take it back from the Argentines. But again, nobody had any maps of the area, so literally the mapping offices of the Royal Navy had to get all these nautical charts together and maps for the ground force and everything, and they had to parachute them via aircraft over the expeditionary force as it was heading south. So basically, they just had to print what they had and kind of meet up along the way. So again, maps are always a problem. The fourth lesson learned is that HF radio is absolutely mandatory. I don't know how much more clear this can be. Even though, I don't want to say like, oh, look, this is a war from 1982. Let's use this as a way to sell ham radio even more. It's not really that way. But it is interesting considering our modern context of, modern infrastructure and communications networks and things like that not really being so reliable. Radio is a great way for that. Back in 1982, in the 80s, the early 80s, the Falkland Islands did not have any external communication other than shortwave radio. That was it. They had snail mail from, ships that would visit, and that's basically it. It was one of the most remote places on Earth. And of course, they had to use radio to get down there. This is something that I think the U.S. Army in today's military has kind of forgotten. And this is one of those little lessons learned that turns into kind of a big digression, but I'll keep it short. The U.S. military right now, and the U.S. populace at large is looking to the Far East, right? We're looking to China, and we're looking to see a great conflict potentially breaking out in the South China Sea, which will probably involve the majority of the Pacific at some point. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion yet, but clearly the U.S. military is moving that way. We call this the Pacific Pivot. Right? All service branches suddenly coming out with technology, doctrine, ways of operating in a more amphibious, littoral kind of way. Well, the Falklands conflict was basically the first shot at this. A military force which had to take an island that was very small, 8,000 miles away from their homeland, and they had to do it with nothing but what they could carry with them because they had no logistics. Sounds very familiar as to what might be going on in the Pacific if a hot war between the United States and China breaks out, or some kind of limited expansion or something like that. Now, I know China's kind of the big boogeyman at the moment, so I don't want to stress this too hard, but look, the U.S. military really, if they aren't already, should really be looking at improving their HF radio communications and not just relying on satellites so much. Almost all of the communications that the U.S. military uses are going to be very, short range comparatively, VHF, UHF kind of stuff, or SATCOM stuff, which would be UHF. So using satellites in an era where satellites are maybe not the most reliable way of working things, and maybe just an old-fashioned HF radio that can be used to talk from one tiny island to another tiny island 1,000 miles away, maybe there's some value in that, and I think the Falklands kind of illustrated that. Comms was a massive nightmare, as it has been a massive nightmare going all the way back to before radios or electricity even existed, back in the days of runners and pennants on the battlefield. Communications has always been a problem, and it's amazing to me, again, to continue the digression, that the U.S. military, in their Pacific pivot, they're not really looking at long-range comms. They're looking at mesh networks. They're looking at man-net kind of stuff. They're looking at putting a drone up or a helicopter up and putting a sensor on every person or soldier. And I just don't see that level of investment going into HF infrastructure. Point-to-point, unit-to-unit, island-to-island kind of thing. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just an idiot and haven't seen it yet. But it sure seems like there's a big push towards things like individual soldier radios, and not so much a huge push to revitalize the HF spectrum. There was a big push for this back a few years ago, but that was a few years ago, and it doesn't seem like there's been a lot of hot new radios come out or a lot of hot new doctrine coming out on the HF side of things. It seems like us all more along the lines of individual soldier solutions, integrating ATAC into every soldier, integrating a, wave relay into every soldier, as opposed to more HF kind of stuff. But anyway, rant done. Radio is very important, especially if you're at a far-flung part of the world, and for those of you who are located in extremely, extremely remote areas, it's even more important for you guys to realize the importance of radio. If I was living in a strategically important place, if I was living in a very, very remote place, I would have a substantial portion of my communications infrastructure being related to radios so that I could relay and serve as a link to the outside world for other people. That's just my own personal opinion, is that if you're in an extremely remote area, you can justify investing quite heavily in things like HF radio and the technology of it, not just the expensive radios themselves, but investing more heavily in developing technologies that allow you to talk over long distances without using a satellite or the internet. I guess the reason for this digression is because, just me thinking, what would I have done if I lived on the Falklands during that conflict? And I think that since I end up spending a lot of time, in the woods, in the middle of nowhere, by myself with a radio, I tend to think in terms of that a lot of times. And I think, man, if there was one guy with a long-range HF radio on a mountaintop and a pair of binoculars, that dude could have done some serious damage to the Argentine force as a resistance member. But, that's just me fantasizing, I suppose. It's really interesting, though, to kind of think of things from that perspective. What can you do if your homeland or your home island is at risk or is being invaded in the worst case scenario? In many cases, like in the case of the Falklands, the locals couldn't really do anything at all. However, maybe working on some comms kind of stuff in that situation could have been very, very important. Moving on to the next lesson learned is that weather will ruin your day, and it is the number one factor that you can't really plan for. Like I've said many, many times, and along with many, many others, weather specifically like the daily forecast down to the day, is going to be extremely, extremely important, especially when it comes to amphibious operations or any kind of expeditionary operation. Weather is going to be the worst right when it needs to be the best. So weather is very, very important to be able to predict, at least over the next few hours. Now, of course, it's not as easy as all that. A lot of times you're not going to have the resources of, weather radar and aerosondes and things like that, weather balloons. You're not going to have these resources that a nation state might have, but being able to whip out your kestrel meter and say, hey guys, it's going to get down to this temperature tonight because the dew point during the day was this level, so it's going to get pretty cold tonight. Being able to discern that and determine, is it going to be foggy tonight, or is it going to be cloud cover tonight, or what? This is a little easier to do than predicting the weather many, many days out, and it's something that an individual can certainly do. Another lesson learned is more strategic, and that is the importance of a jumping off point. Of course, in reference to Ascension Island, really the only other sort of colonial territory, protectorate kind of thing for the UK was Ascension Island. And that was still a few thousand miles away from the Falklands. But like is stated in the book, if Ascension Island wasn't there, the British would have had to have built it herself. So the importance of having a jumping off point, a staging area, somewhere that's not necessarily just like a bug out location, but more along the lines of a staging area to help you move throughout an area. That's very, very important. And this kind of leads to the next point, which is something that is definitely more of a strategic thing, but I'm going to talk about it in the context of the average person out there. And that is the idea of fighting with a ruck on your back. Speaking in the context of the gear world, we all know the difference between like a rucksack and an assault pack, right? What's the difference between the two, and why do we have this doctrine, right? Why does that Alice pack from way back in the day have that quick release shoulder strap? Why is that? Well, largely it's because of military doctrine developed over a very long period of time, really since World War II, is that the average soldier's weight that's on their back has been increasing since Korea, really. And the general idea is that a soldier patrolling with their unit out in the field is going to be carrying a very heavy rucksack on their back because they need to live out of that backpack for a long period of time. But if they get into a situation where they get ambushed or they start taking contact or something like that, they need to be able to quickly drop that rucksack off their back so they have more maneuverability, and it's a lot easier to fight when you don't have 80 pounds of junk on your back. That's the reason for this doctrine. And this is the reason for the assault pack as well. The kind of implication being, all right, look, you move to a staging area, you take your rucksack off, you leave that at the patrol base, you put your assault pack on, and that backpack stays on your back during the conflict. This is very generally the way that military doctrine has kind of outlined this. Now, interestingly enough, and this is not at all linked to the Falklands conflict, but I'm drawing this link, is that in the prepared citizen space, we a lot of times don't have the option to drop that 80-pound ruck. We don't have the option to do that. We have to fight with it on our back because we can't afford to drop it and come back to it later after the skirmish or action is over. We have to take what we've got with us. This is especially poignant in the mountains, where the general theory among mountain warfare is that if you get separated from your rucksack, your life expectancy goes down drastically because you just need a lot of stuff to survive in high altitude conditions. Well, the British kind of had the same idea when it came to the Falklands War, and that is that they had to fight with a stream of cargo vessels basically on their back. They had to fight the Argentines while also protecting their cargo vessels and landing ships from the Argentine planes and things like that. Now, it turns out that after the war, after interviewing a lot of Argentine pilots, they found out that one of the reasons why the Argentines did not attack so many British vessels and why so many ships were not targeted is because they had trained on ground targets on the land. So if the Argentines had spent more time training on anti-ship targeting, oh man, the British would have had a much, much harder time. And as is, what few vessels did get sunk on the British side definitely hindered logistics efforts. So, here you have this expeditionary force, 8,000 miles from home, having to deal with a foreign adversary with near-peer weapons, and you're also having to protect a fleet of largely unarmed civilian craft, which contain basically all of the things you need to wage this war. This is something that often gets forgotten because, again, in the American context of things, we don't really do things this much anymore. We have staging bases and patrol bases, and we have all different kinds of logistics hubs and things like that that are largely largely more separated. But in a naval war at sea, thousands of miles away from the nearest friendly land, your ships are very, very, very vulnerable. Which is why it kind of highlights the importance of thinking outside the box when it comes to military doctrine and today's, prepared citizen. You may have to fight with that Ruck on your back. You may not have the luxury of dropping that sucker and then coming back to it later. You might actually have to do the impossible and return fire and, move off the X while carrying an obscene amount of gear with you. Not ideal by any means, but this is something to think about for sure. Along those same lines, improvisation is absolutely key. It does not matter what it was designed to do, it matters what it can do. If you have a piece of gear or a piece of equipment or whatever, you have to be able to plan for that to act outside of its intended role. With the British forces, one of the very first things they had to figure out how to do was convert a lot of the ballast tanks on board commercial freighters into gas tanks, basically. So they had to modify a lot of commercial shipping vessels so that they could have that extended fuel range to actually make it down to the Falklands, or at least Ascension Island. When it comes to the prepared citizen space, this definitely applies, and I'm really working through some challenges on this when it comes to radios, because a lot of the times, or rather almost all of the time, when it comes to civilian-based ham radio, the gear itself is exceptionally fragile. It's very difficult to find something durable and versatile in the ham radio world, and when you do, you're going to end up paying a lot of money for it. Right now, I understand that, kind of minimalistic setups are kind of the thing, but, it's really frustrating a lot of times to see just really fiddly and brittle and delicate stuff being in the prepared citizen space when it comes to radios and things, that when you put that gear into a contingent situation, is it going to be able to perform? Most of the time, probably not. Like, I guarantee you that if you take at least 95% of all ham radio equipment out there in the civilian space and you try to use it in the rain, you're going to have a lot of problems, or you're probably going to just break it, right? So this is something important to consider when you're trying to operate, more autonomously, or you're by yourself and you're trying to get more capabilities out of something. You really have to consider, all right, war game time, let's just say the power went out, now can I run this piece of gear? Oh, okay, the sun isn't shining for 3 or 4 days because it's raining. Can I run this gear? Now it's going to be a blizzard, this weekend. Can I run this gear during that? Being able to take something and actually use it in a contingent situation is a lot different than, operating a radio in a sunny park on a nice, comfortable weekend, right? And this sort of segues into the final point, which is kind of a hard to explain concept, but one of the biggest problems that the ground force had in the Falklands was seizing an objective and then having to sit there and wait for their logistics to catch up. This is, again, a tale as old as time, going all the way back to World War II, where the panzers rolling through France had to sit and wait for fuel to get to them before they could seize the objective and capitalize on a retreating enemy. Same thing in the Falklands and pretty much every military conflict that's relied on maneuverability, but really this is why logistics is important to over-prepare for, because if you're going into an objective, if you're trying to do something and you get there and you realize the situation has changed and now you can go further, that's something to plan for as well. Maintaining flexibility is super, super important, and you can really only be flexible if you have prepared to do so. Like many, many military strategists have observed, going all the way back to Napoleon and beyond, some of the best military leaders throughout the history of the world have not been great military leaders because they were exceptionally clever or outwitted their enemy, but rather they were highly effective combat leaders because they were able to leave themselves more options than their adversary during a contingent situation. If you have the option to pursue a retreating force, that's a good option for you. Then you can choose. You can make the decision to stay where you are and top off your logistical reserves, or you can pursue that adversary. But if you assaulted a hill and you took an objective and you're out of food and ammo and water, you're not going anywhere, and that's an option that's reduced for you. So the same thing kind of applies to whatever a prepared citizenry, group or whatever might want to do. There are certainly a wide variety of concerns that the average citizen has to have, especially in today's world, here in the the United States, we've got a lot of concerns. We've got everything from natural disasters one weekend to, hostile aircraft over American soil the next weekend. It's just a hot mess, right? We've got a lot of different things to prepare for and be concerned about and track and monitor and all kinds of stuff like that. And the interesting thing is that this stuff is the baseline for a more prepared citizenry who's trying to be, capable and hard-charging and stuff like that, and trying to overcome some of the problems that we're facing in the country today. The Falklands conflict really highlights the importance of being able to struggle through a tough time and take an objective in a faraway land with no food, no water, no ammo, and once that goal is achieved, looking at the next goal and keeping moving, even when you're at the absolute limits of your logistical chain. That's probably one of the bigger strategic lessons we can learn from this book and from this conflict. Not too many of us are going to be taking a substantial naval force and conducting amphibious landings on an island 8,000 miles away, but the average citizen might be called to go sit on a hill with a pair of binoculars, and when their time there is done, they might be called to move on to the next hill, and so on. And they've got to be able to self-sustain, bring their logistics with them, and if necessary, fight with those logistics. A lot of times it's challenging to take a lot of these military lessons learned and put them in the context of a prepared citizenry which may or may not have military experience. But that's okay. The larger strategic lessons are something to work from, and we can drill down on this and expand on a lot of these topics in the future. The Falklands War is what happens when a whole empire has to fight with their ruck on their back and bring everything with them that they're going to need for situations that they might not even understand at the time. Preparedness doesn't necessarily equate to bringing more stuff with you. This isn't necessarily a proof of concept or a confirmation that 150-pound rucksack is a good idea. No, it's more along the lines of being able to pick and choose what you're capable of doing, understand that logistics is really hard work, and if you're trying to do logistics or you're trying to operate in very remote terrain, like many of us are going to have to do, it's very, very challenging, especially considering you're going to have to either pre-stage or bring a lot of this logistical stuff with you. So I think that'll wrap things up for today. I know kind of a random assortment of thoughts, but I promise we will be getting to some of these more complicated ideas in the future, and we're going to cherry pick a lot of this content for future videos. So don't think we're done talking about the Falklands. We're going to be definitely diving into this a little bit more, but for now, this is kind of an introduction to the conflict itself, especially from the perspective of logistics. So thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.